Imagine a cold Siberian morning, frost on the iron bars, and a weary prisoner kneeling in prayer. In the 1930s to 1960s, the Soviet Union tried to stamp out religion with brute force. Churches were boarded up, pastors dragged off in the night, and believers were mocked or worse. Under communism, worshiping God could land you in a labor camp. Yet behind the barbed wire of one such camp, a true story of courage and miracles unfolded. It's the story of a man who wouldn't give up his faith, and the old ox named Maxim who helped him. To understand our story, we need the backdrop of the Soviet persecution era. Communist leaders declared war on religion. They believed faith in God had no place in their utopia. As a result, thousands of churches were shut down, and many pastors were arrested simply for preaching about Jesus. Christians worshipped in secret house gatherings, always fearing a knock on the door. Propaganda poured scorn on people who believed in old superstitions. In school and society, believers, especially those who kept the seventh-day Sabbath, were labeled as backward or disloyal. One cruel policy was the enforced six-day work week, which meant Saturday was a normal workday. For Sabbath keepers, this was a direct attack on their faith. Many Christians refused to work on Saturdays, honoring the Bible's commandment to rest on the seventh day. But their loyalty came at a price. Soviet bosses would punish or fire anyone who missed Saturday work. Some were fined, others lost their jobs, and some were even jailed for violating labor laws by resting on the Sabbath. The government called them lazy or parasites, yet these believers held firm. They remembered God's law. The seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord. In it thou shalt not do any work, nor thy cattle. Exodus 20:10. In other words, even an ox or a donkey was meant to rest on God's holy day. Still, in the Soviet Union, resting on Saturday could make you an enemy of the state. This was the world of our story, a world where faith was tested at every turn. But even in this hostile climate, courageous Christians stood up for God. In the midst of this persecution, we meet a remarkable man whose personal trial would become a legend of Sabbath faith. Nickolai Panchuk was one of those steadfast believers. He was a humble pastor in Ukraine, guiding small underground congregations that met in barns and homes. By all accounts, Nickolai was completely devoted to God. He led 11 house churches during these difficult days, teaching his members to trust God no matter what. When the secret police, the KGB, harassed him for information, Nickolai refused to betray his fellow Christians. He would not give up the names of church members, even under great pressure. This quiet, gentle pastor showed surprising courage. He believed in obeying God above all, even if it meant angering powerful men. Eventually, the Soviet authorities decided they'd had enough of Pastor Nickolai's influence. Preaching about the seventh-day Sabbath and encouraging people to worship God was, in their eyes, a serious crime. Nickolai was arrested for his faith and charged with being disloyal to the atheist state. He had done nothing violent or immoral. His crime was simply refusing to work on God's Sabbath and refusing to stop sharing Jesus. The KGB agents demanded he renounce his beliefs. He would not. They ordered him to work on Saturdays. He quietly answered, "I must honor God's holy day." For that stance, Nickolai was sentenced to years of hard labor in Siberia. He was torn from his family and shipped off on a crowded train to a frozen prison camp, far from home. The year was around the 1950s, and Nickolai was about to enter a personal valley of suffering for the sake of his faith. Persecuted for his Christian faith, he remained in the Siberian camp for years, refusing to sacrifice his beliefs and suffering the consequences. Even as he stepped off the train into knee-deep snow, Nickolai whispered a prayer, "Lord, help me to keep courage and be faithful to you." Little did he know how severe the tests would be. In the Siberian prison camp, the commanders tried to crush Nickolai's faith immediately. The very first Sabbath that came, Nickolai politely refused to do the required work. Instead, he rested and worshipped privately, honoring the fourth commandment. The guards were furious. They beat him with fists and sticks, leaving him bruised. "You will work next Saturday, or else," they growled. Nickolai simply answered that he could not disobey God. When the second Sabbath arrived, Nickolai again stood firm. This time the officers dragged him into a tiny wooden crate kept out by the cowshed, a crude punishment cell known grimly as the box. It was so small that a grown man could neither stand upright nor stretch out fully. They shoved Nickolai inside this cramped crate, where he had to sit curled with his knees to his chest. Then they bolted the door and left him there in the dark. He would stay locked in that miserable box for 10 days. The only thing they gave him was a little water, no food at all. Cold winds slipped through the cracks. Nights in Siberia can drop well below freezing, and Nickolai had only his threadbare prison clothes. It was a calculated torture to break his will. How did Nickolai survive those days? Later he would recall that only prayer and hymns kept him sane. Hunched in darkness, he whispered the Bible verses he could remember and softly sang hymns like "God will take care of you." Other prisoners could hear him faintly. Many knew him by the nickname the preacher in the box. Instead of screaming or cursing, he was praying and praising God from inside a torture crate. One kind guard, moved by Nickolai's devotion, snuck him an extra piece of bread a couple of times. That guard risked his job to show mercy, and Nickolai thanked God for this small miracle of compassion. After 10 long days, they pulled Nickolai out. He was alive but weak and stiff. His legs were so numb he could hardly stand. They let him recover for 2 days and put him on normal work duty for a couple more. But when the next Saturday came, Nickolai once again would not work. True to his convictions, he rested on the Sabbath. And just as surely, the officers threw him back into the box for another 10-day stretch. Thus, a cruel cycle began. 10 days in the box, 2 days to regain his strength, 2 days of forced labor, then back into the box. This went on week after week, month after month. Amazingly, this routine of suffering lasted nearly 2 years. Try to imagine it. For over 100 Sabbaths in a row, Pastor Nickolai languished in that tiny crate because he would not break God's fourth commandment. By human logic, he should have died or gone insane, but his faith only burned brighter. Other inmates began to respect the gaunt, soft-spoken pastor who would rather endure starvation in a wooden box than disobey his God. Nickolai's unbreakable spirit was a living sermon. Even some guards started to feel uneasy. Why couldn't they break this man? What secret strength did he have? Nickolai would smile through cracked lips and tell anyone who asked, "God is with me in this box." It was as if the story of Daniel in the lion's den was replaying, with Nickolai in a box and the lions of cruelty unable to destroy his faith. After 2 years of this relentless torture, something happened that changed everything. A higher-ranking Soviet officer, a colonel, came to inspect the camp. When he learned that a prisoner was being regularly locked in a packing crate for refusing Saturday work, the colonel was outraged. Not outraged at Nickolai, but at the camp warden. Perhaps the colonel thought this punishment was excessive, or perhaps he simply wanted the camp's labor output maximized. Either way, he ordered that Nickolai be released from the box immediately. Nickolai stretched his cramped limbs and breathed a prayer of thanks. He assumed the worst was finally over, but in truth, a new test and an astounding miracle were about to begin. After freeing Nickolai from the crate, the visiting colonel still had a challenge for him. The camp authorities resented that Nickolai's Sabbath stance disrupted their work schedule. So the colonel proposed a compromise, or what seemed like one. He assigned Nickolai to one of the hardest jobs in the entire camp, hauling water. Every day, Nickolai was to fill a wooden cart with barrels of water for the prisoners and guards. An aging ox named Maxim would pull the cart. The catch? Nickolai must deliver the camp's full water supply in 6 days instead of the usual 7. If he could manage that, the colonel said, Nickolai would be permitted to rest every Sabbath. But if he failed even once, he'd have to work on Saturdays like everyone else, or face worse punishment. The colonel looked Nickolai in the eyes and essentially said, if you can get all the water this camp needs for the week in 6 days, then you can have your Sabbath off. Nickolai's heart leapt with hope and trembled a little. Was this a door God was opening, or another trap? He had no choice but to try. With God's help, I will do my best, he replied quietly. Deep down, the camp officers were certain this task would break the stubborn preacher. Every week the camp required a huge amount of water, drawn from a spring far downhill and lugged up a rugged path. It normally took a team working all 7 days to keep up. Now a single man and a slow old ox had to do it in 6 days. The guard smirked and whispered, he'll never manage. We'll have him back in the box or begging to work on Saturdays in no time. They even gave the ox a heavy-handed prod, saying, let's see if your God will make this lazy animal go faster. Nickolai himself saw the difficulties. Maxim the ox was gentle but past his prime, and the trail to the spring was long and often muddy or icy. Each morning he would have to hitch Maxim to an ox cart, travel a mile or more to the spring, fill up 16 large barrels of water, and then coax the ox back, pulling the sloshing heavy load over frozen ground. And he'd have to do trip after trip, as many as it took to meet the daily quota. The first day of this new assignment, Nickolai prayed, Lord, I'm going to honor your Sabbath. Please honor my efforts. Then he clicked his tongue and urged, Gee up, Maxim. The ox snorted and began to plod forward. That day and for the next several days, Nickolai and Maxim labored from dawn until collapsing dusk. The old ox moved at his normal pace, which is to say, very slowly. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They hauled load after load, but by week's end they were still short of the full water requirement. Each night Nickolai fell into his bunk utterly exhausted, muscles aching. He was working as hard as any man could, but it wasn't enough. By Thursday evening, a knot of worry tightened in Nickolai's chest. How will we ever carry double loads in time, he thought. The Sabbath was approaching, and if the water wasn't all delivered, then the officers would surely force him to work on Saturday or throw him back in the box. Some other prisoners taunted him, So, preacher, looks like your God isn't helping that ox go any faster. Even kind-hearted inmates shook their heads in pity. They knew that to haul 7 days' worth of water in only 6 days was humanly impossible. Nickolai stroked the ox's neck and whispered, Maxim, we need a miracle. Let's pray tomorrow will be different. Friday dawned cold and gray. Nickolai got up before the bugle, knelt on the straw, and pleaded with God for strength. This was the 6th day, the day that would decide everything. He went to the ox's stall and gave old Maxim a gentle pat. Today is Friday, friend. Let's do our best, he said aloud. The guards watched with folded arms, ready to see the Sabbath man fail. Nickolai took a deep breath, then snapped the reins. What happened next stunned everyone. On that Friday, it was as if heaven gave Maxim the ox an energy boost. The sluggish animal suddenly threw its shoulders into the harness and took off at a brisk pace. Nickolai almost stumbled as he hurried alongside the cart. Down to the spring they went, faster than ever before. Maxim usually had to be prodded to move. Now the ox marched with determination. After filling the barrels, Nickolai guided him back, expecting the ox to tire. But Maxim kept going strong. All day long on this 6th day of the week, the ox worked with supernatural vigor. He didn't slow down or demand rest. He made extra trips to the spring that Nickolai had never dreamed possible. The other prisoners stopped their own tasks to watch in amazement as the ox trotted back and forth, back and forth. By sundown on Friday, Nickolai and Maxim had hauled in the full week's water rations for the entire camp, all 16 barrels for the day, plus the additional barrels needed for the next day. In fact, they finished just as the sun was setting and the Sabbath was about to begin. With trembling hands, Nickolai unhitched the panting but strangely content ox and whispered, "Good boy, Maxime. You did it. God helped us do it." The guards were speechless. By every calculation, the preacher should have failed the challenge. But here they were, with more than enough water to last through the next day. On Saturday morning, true to the agreement, Nickolai did not report for work, and there was no need for him to. The camp had plenty of water for the day. Skeptical officers said, well, maybe yesterday was a fluke of good weather. But when they tried to make Maxime pull a cart on that Sabbath, the ox refused to move an inch. They cracked a whip. He flicked his ears and stood stubborn. They shouted. He placidly chewed his cud. The ox that had practically run on Friday would not budge on Saturday, no matter what anyone did. It was as if Maxime himself understood which day was God's holy day of rest. The prisoners laughed under their breath at the sight of frustrated guards yelling at a stubborn ox. Nickolai spent the Sabbath quietly thanking God. He knew heaven had intervened. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, the scripture says, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord. Exodus 29:10. In ancient times, God provided manna in the wilderness, a double portion on the 6th day, so his people could rest on the 7th. Now, in a modern Siberian wilderness, God had provided water in double measure on the 6th day, so his servant could keep the Sabbath. A miracle? Everyone in that camp, believer or not, recognized that something extraordinary had occurred. And the miracle did not happen just once. Week after week, for years, the pattern repeated. From Sunday through Thursday, old Maxime would plod along at his normal lazy pace, often frustrating Nickolai as he tried to get a little ahead. But every Friday, without fail, Maxime's strength seemed renewed. He moved with astonishing speed, hauling twice the usual amount of water. Then every Sabbath, the ox absolutely refused to work. It was as if an unseen hand flipped a switch in that creature's mind, telling him, Friday, work hard. Saturday, it's Sabbath, don't work. The inmates began to smile and say, Maxime needs no calendar, he knows when it's Sabbath. Even the cynical camp warden had to admit something was happening beyond his control. He reportedly shook his head and grumbled, that preacher made a Sabbath keeper of the ox. Imagine that, a rough Soviet officer acknowledging that this dumb animal was honoring the day of God, all because of one man's faith. Nickolai's unwavering obedience and the seventh-day ox miracle became the talk of the camp. Hardened criminals and atheist guards alike witnessed tangible evidence of the God of the Bible. They saw that God's power is real enough to stop an ox in its tracks. Nickolai was no longer ridiculed as a fanatic. Many treated him with a quiet reverence. After all, they had seen with their own eyes that when this prisoner honored the Sabbath, his God provided for him in a marvelous way. God had proven that his law cannot be trampled without consequence, even by a beast of burden. The Sabbath miracle continued for as long as Nickolai remained in that camp. It was a continuous testimony that them that honor me, I will honor. 1 Samuel 2:30. We've just witnessed God's incredible miracle. The ox working double on Friday and standing still on Sabbath. Nickolai's faith was rewarded openly. But what happened next? In the final years of Nickolai's imprisonment, this weekly wonder changed hearts. Let's see how this test of faith ended and what impact it left on others. For the camp guards, Nickolai's case had been a test of wills. They wanted to break his allegiance to the seventh-day Sabbath. Instead, they ended up watching a miracle unfold under their noses. Nickolai's faith had been tested to the extreme, and it was proven genuine. The very commandment they tried to force him to violate was exalted in the sight of all. The guards, who once mocked him, could no longer deny that something supernatural was at work. They had done everything to crush this quiet pastor. Beatings, solitary confinement, humiliation. Yet he came out of each trial with peace and resolve. Now the miracle ox had made it plain. Nickolai's God was real and mighty. How else could an animal be so consistent, week after week, defying any human training? The camp warden and officers largely left Nickolai alone after this. In fact, honoring the deal, they allowed him his Sabbaths free from that point on. Some of the guards even began to show respect when speaking to him. And remember that sympathetic guard who used to sneak Nickolai bread in the box? One can imagine that his faith in God deepened as he witnessed these events. Nickolai's unwavering witness led others in the camp to believe in Jesus and to admire the God of the Bible. A few fellow prisoners started keeping the Sabbath themselves quietly, moved by Nickolai's example. In a place designed to destroy faith, faith was spreading. The light of God's truth had pierced the darkness of the labor camp. Nickolai remained humble through it all. He didn't boast about the miracle or see himself as a hero. He often said, "It was God, not me. God sent that ox. God gave me strength." The Sabbath for him was not just a theory. It was life itself. With each passing week of seeing God provide, Nickolai's love and trust in the Lord grew stronger. Instead of being broken, his testimony grew stronger with each trial. Other prisoners would quietly ask him, "Pastor, why do you care so much about one day?" Nickolai would smile and answer, "Because it's God's day, a holy day. He created it for our blessing. And God has never let me down when I honor him." His life lent weight to his words. There he was, a man unjustly imprisoned, yet filled with peace and forgiveness. He even showed kindness to his tormentors when he could. Truly, God had given him a victory, not just over the forced labor, but over hatred and fear. This entire experience showed that God was in control, even behind Soviet barbed wire. Nature itself obeyed the Creator's Sabbath in that camp. In the end, who had been the fool? Not Nickolai, but those who thought they could snuff out God's law. Nickolai's steadfastness proved that no oppressor can take away the freedom of a conscience bound to God. The miracle of Maxim the ox testified that God's power is greater than any earthly power. As Scripture says, "If God be for us, who can be against us?" Romans 8:31. Nickolai's captors learned that fighting a man of faith was actually fighting the God he served, a battle they could never win. With the Sabbath issue settled by divine intervention, Nickolai carried on through his prison term with a quiet joy. He had the assurance that God was with him every step and every ox cart pull of the way. And God was not finished writing this story. A new chapter was about to begin. Freedom for Nickolai, and the sharing of this testimony with the world beyond the camp. After 10 long years in captivity, Pastor Nickolai Panchuk was finally released from the Siberian labor camp. The exact circumstances of his release aren't fully recorded, but likely the changing political climate in the Soviet Union played a part. It was the early 1960s, and some religious prisoners were being freed as the regime ever so slightly relaxed its iron grip. Nickolai, battered but unbroken, stepped out of those prison gates a free man. One can only imagine his first act as a free person was to kneel on the earth and thank God for carrying him through. He returned home to his family and to the little flock of believers who had been praying for him through all those years. They wept and rejoiced to see their beloved pastor alive. And Nickolai had an amazing story to tell, the story of the seventh-day ox. As Nickolai recounted the miracles he had witnessed, fellow believers were strengthened in their faith. His testimony spread by word of mouth through the underground Christian community. In secret gatherings, people would share, "Did you hear about the pastor in Siberia and the ox that wouldn't work on Sabbath?" To those worshiping in hiding, afraid of persecution, Nickolai's experience was like fresh wind in their sails. It showed that God still worked miracles for those who honor him. It also showed that keeping the Sabbath was worth any cost because God was faithful. It was an encouraging beacon during a time when many were tempted to give up under pressure. If God could use an ox to uphold his Sabbath in a prison camp, he could certainly take care of his people elsewhere. The legacy of Nickolai's ordeal extended even to that Siberian camp after he left. Here's an astonishing footnote. Old Maxim the ox continued his Sabbath habit even without Nickolai there. According to reports, when a new prisoner was assigned to do the water hauling and tried to make Maxim work on Saturdays, the ox still refused. All the beatings and yells wouldn't get that animal to take a single step on the seventh day. 6 days he would work, but on the Sabbath, Maxim planted his hooves and stood firm. The camp officers and inmates remembered, "This is Nickolai's ox, he only works 6 days." What a sense of humor and victory on God's part. Long after his human servant had departed, God left a mute preacher behind in that ox. Every Sabbath that Maxim rested was like a memorial to the truth Nickolai had stood for. The witness remained in that camp, silently pointing everyone to the Creator of the seventh day. In later years, believers recounted the seventh-day ox story in churches, at camp meetings, and even in print, so that it would not be forgotten. It has inspired countless Christians around the world. This story is told to children and adults alike as an example of courageous faith. It reminds us that even behind the Iron Curtain, God had his heroes. Nickolai Panchuk's name became associated with unyielding Sabbath fidelity and God's miraculous care. What is most important, however, is not the fame of the man, but the glory of God who made it all happen. Nickolai eventually passed to his rest. He lived out his days faithfully, but the impact of his experience lives on. His life shouts the same message that the 3 Hebrews in Babylon proclaimed, or Daniel in the lion's den, or any persecuted believer. God is able to deliver, and even if he doesn't deliver immediately, we will not bow to any other. In Nickolai's case, God delivered in a creative, unforgettable way. The legacy can be summed up simply: honor God's Sabbath, and God will honor you. So, whether our trial is big or small, let's remember Nickolai's lesson. God comes through for those who trust him completely. Our challenges might be different, but the same God who strengthened a faithful pastor and an ox in Siberia is alive and able to help us today. In the end, the story of the seventh-day ox is not really about an ox, or even about a man. It's about God. A God who is faithful to his promises, a God who says, "Them that honor me I will honor," 1 Samuel 2:30, and keeps that promise. That same God invites you today. Will you trust me? Will you step out in faith and follow me, even if others don't, even if it's hard? If your answer is yes, then get ready to see his hand in your life. It may not always be dramatic, but it will always be for your good. So, dear friend, take courage. The Sabbath miracle of Siberia shows that no situation is too dark, no burden too heavy for God to intervene. He can use even an old ox to perform wonders. What more can he do through a willing heart like yours? Surrender your worries and trials to him. Stand firm for what is right. And watch how God will write the next chapter of your story of faith. Who knows? Perhaps one day in heaven, you'll meet Nickolai Panchuk and old Maxim, and together we'll praise the God who never forsakes his own. Until then, remember, God honors those who honor him. May you and I live out that truth every day by his grace. Amen.
Frost on iron, prayer on breath, snow light washing bars of steel. Lord, your Sabbath I will keep. Take my fear and make me still. Boots and shouting, fists and night, yet a lamp keeps burning on. In the silence of the box, faith keeps singing like a song. If the darkness crowds my name, your commandment is my light. 6 days labor, grace for strength, on the seventh holy quiet. 6 days the cart rolls on the seventh we belong to the Lord who split the sea, who makes the captive free. Double mercies on the 6th, rest that no man can annul. God will honor those who honor him. My heart knows it's true. Old Maxim, the patient ox, yoke and barrel, hill and cold, down the path and back again, plodding like the saints of old. Come the 6th day, heaven's breath, strength trust the word, and on Sabbath rest instead. 6 days the cart rolls on the seventh we belong to the Lord who split the sea, who makes the captive free. Double mercies on the sixth, rest that no man can annul. God will honor those who honor him. My heart knows it's true. Like Daniel in the lion's den, like fire that couldn't burn, faith stands up to tyrant winds. Every Sabbath hearts return. If an ox can heed your call, how much more a child of dust? Write your law upon my heart, teach my weary bones to trust. 6 days the cart rolls on the seventh we belong. Chains fall quiet, hope is strong. God, you sing the freedom song. Double mercies on the sixth, rest that storms cannot undo.